Kia ora te whānau, I hukarati ko, Andrew Doubleday aho. Today we're looking at the Gospel for Sunday the 2nd of August 2026. The lectionary reading is Matthew chapter 14 verses 13 through to 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. And when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came and said to him, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, we commonly know this as the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Only 5,000 men, to be sure, excluding women and children. And we don't know exactly how that society would have worked and whether there were mainly men there or whether there would have been a much broader group of people. We just don't know. The total number is unknown. We find this story in all 4 of the Gospels, which is actually quite rare. And we'll be taking for today mainly about our lead with the context as we find it in Matthew's Gospel. Now, Mark's context follows the same pattern. The execution of John the Baptist is what gives birth to all of this. Luke locates this event at Bethsaida, which I found interesting. Bethsaida, if you can picture a map of the Sea of Galilee in your mind, right at the top right corner, almost a corner, is Bethsaida, up on the road up to Syria. And it's around from the next village around from Capernaum, which was the base of operations for Jesus and his disciples. And that's where Luke locates it. Now, he mentions the death of John the Baptist immediately prior to launching into his story, but he puts it in the more distant past. John gives no immediate context prior to this story. His emphasis is that the Passover is near, and that figures for John, because when you look at that core center of his gospel, it's all around the great feasts. And so for him, these two things go together. The thing is this, is that in terms of the story itself, the details are consistent across all 4. They're all telling the same story. So let's start with the miracle itself, because this is likely to be the bit that's the most contentious. For some of you, I would expect there be those of you who'd say, this is just a story, it didn't happen. None of it happened, it didn't happen at all. It's written for a different kind of purpose, and, well, okay. I want to suggest, in terms of something happening, the possibility of 2 options. I tend to have my favourite. You're free to choose either of these or none of these. The first is that no miracle actually happened in terms of multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fish. To feed so many is a logistical nightmare. It's difficult to imagine how we could explain that. Imagine the time that it would take to actually go through this process and feed such a large group of people. Besides, we're educated people. This is the 3rd decade of the 21st century. We don't really think that miracles actually happen. So what we have here then is the possibility of the miracle of sharing. The example, we don't see it as a small boy in Matthew's account, but in one of the other accounts is of a small boy who has these loaves and fishes, and he's willing to share his lunch, and his example was so powerful that it touched everything else to share what they had. Apparently they brought more than enough for everybody to be fully satisfied and to have 12 basketfuls of leftovers that were all collected up at the end. Well, okay, it's an option. And then there's the other one, which for me is accepting that something miraculous actually happened. How might I rationalize it? I have a somewhat naive suggestion. And it starts with what I know is that the physicists tell us that all matter is ultimately complex patterns of energy. That there are electrons flowing all the time that are part of me, that are in this moment becoming part of the desk I'm sitting at, or at the camera that I'm talking to, or flowing across into my home where my family lives, becoming part of them as other electrons flow in the opposite direction. We are intimately interconnected with everything. We are complex patterns of energy. But there is nothing solid really about us. That in fact we're more space than we are actual physical. There's a huge amount of space. We can make all sorts of jokes about that, but there's a huge amount of space within us. And I've read it said that if we took all the matter in our galaxy and took out all the space to leave only that which was solid, it would take up less space than a small sugar cube. Go figure. So here we are, complex patterns of energy. And here we are faced with Jesus, God incarnate, God in human flesh, with all the energy of the universe at his back. Why would it seem so incredible that he could harness that energy into new patterns? Like a Star Trek Replicator, if you've followed that series at all. Jean-Luc Picard pulling up to the replicator and says, Earl Grey hot. And a cup of Earl Grey hot appears. And so here we have Jesus able, harnessing the patterns of energy of the universe to be able to recreate more loaves of bread, more full small fish. If you follow me at all, you'll know that I love sci-fi, so I'll just leave that with you. So let's just park that and get back then to Matthew's account of the story. As with so much of Scripture, context is crucial. Our text opened with the words, "Now when Jesus heard this," this lays the ground for all that follows. Now Jesus heard what? The previous 12 verses unpack that for us. They tell of the drama leading to the execution, the murder of John the Baptist by Herod. Finishing with the words, referring to John's disciples, they went and told Jesus. So they went and told Jesus. We then pick up the narrative. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. See how significant this is? I want to suggest that this could well be simply a grief response. This has hit Jesus hard, and he knows that it has also hit his disciples hard. Some were previously disciples of John. Not only is this a grief response, the loss of the one who started all of this, and remember how important that was. John was the forerunner. He's the one whose early ministry was to prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah, for the coming of Jesus. He was the one who baptized Jesus, which was basically the starting point for Jesus' formal ministry. So we see how important he was at that point. The other thing is that he may have been the only ally they really had. And for them, it also leaves the Jesus Project exposed. They are now front and centre. John's off the scene. Now everything focuses on them. And maybe they're thinking, we're on our own. Are we next? Are we the next matter of concern, of threat to power? So grief and perhaps fear, a little bit of fear mixed in here. And Jesus' first impulse is to draw aside. I suspect that's probably the first impulse of most of us. Find a place to grieve, to lick our wounds, to regroup, and then to plan what's next. What do we do now? But they're not given that option. I want to suggest here that their grief may well be shared by thousands, because they've all heard what's happened. And what we know is that bad news travels very quickly. And perhaps they're all simply wanting to find their bearings, to look again for solid ground. They'd respected John the Baptist, odd though he was. Felt deeply indebted to him. Many of them would have. Perhaps saw him as their North Star. At the very least, they knew him to be a truth teller. We get a sense of that towards the end of this gospel, where Jesus cleanses the temple, driving out the merchants and bankers, and he's challenged by the religious authorities. Who gave you the right? Who gave you the authority to do this? So what does Jesus do? He responds, as he often does, to a question with a question of his own. He says, you answer my question and I'll answer yours. By whose authority did John baptize? Was it his own or was it from above? And now they're trapped and they know it. Because they feared that if they said his own, they knew what would happen. There'd be a riot. Because the people believed that John was sent by God. And if they agreed that John was in fact a prophet, Jesus could then respond, then why did you not believe him? So they say, well, we don't know. And Jesus says, well, I won't tell you then by whose authority I do this. The point of this is that it points to the honour and respect in which John is held by the people. So his murder by the Roman appointed king hits them hard. So where do they now look? They look to Jesus. This is putting the spotlight even more firmly on him. They too are looking for comfort. They carefully track Jesus and his movements and have arrived at where he's going before he even gets there. Thousands of them. So what does Jesus do? How does he respond? Does he respond with frustration, with anger, with rage? With a, oh, great? No. He recognizes that this is something that the Father is doing. His task, and the task of the disciples, is to respond in the moment. And in being a source of comfort and healing to others, he finds comfort and healing for himself. Think about that. This doesn't mean that he doesn't take time to be alone, to process his grief. As we'll see in next week's reading, he does. But I suggest he will come to that with a different objective. Where before this event, Jesus' question might have been, why? How did you allow this to happen as he's at prayer? And how do we get past this? His question now might be, okay, what now? What happens next? His next prayer time responds to the current moment and is future oriented. Sometimes, I suspect more often than not, the best way of dealing with grief and with trauma is not to be overly focused on it, going over it again and again and again. Because what that tends to do is it tends to deepen the grooves of the neural pathways in our own minds. We can end up re-traumatizing ourselves. For some, simply accepting what has happened. Because the truth is that when something has happened, we can't change that. To accept what has happened, and rather than being consumed by it, quietly moving on. And this can be the best healing pathway. My hunch is that this is what Jesus is doing here for himself and with his disciples. It's in this place where they've been offering healing to others that they have found healing for themselves. This group of people is in pain. Jesus subsumes his own pain by responding to theirs. And there's a word that's used here that is only used in the Gospels of Jesus or of the God character that Jesus portrays in some of his parables. It's the Greek word splanchnizomai. It's translated here as compassion. When he went ashore, this is in verse 14, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them. In the King James, this word was sometimes translated as bowels of mercy, because the word splanchnon relates to the gut, to the very pit of who we are. And there's a sense of, when it's talked about in this context, of that turning over within us. You know, when we're deeply moved by something, that's the part where we feel our insides, our hearts turning over within us. And this is what's happening with Jesus. He sees the crowds, his heart turns over within us. He wants to do something. He wants to make a difference. He wants to heal and renew and restore. He's deeply moved. In Matthew 9, he sees the crowd as harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and he has splanchnizomai on them, for them, toward them. He's deeply moved. He sees their lostness, and he wants to heal. He wants to restore. He wants to renew. In the parable of the prodigal son, or the lost son, when the father, who I suspect is day by day in his upper room watching the distance to see his scapegrace son return, when he recognizes the image of his defeated son finding his way home, he's moved, it says, with splanchnizomai. He's deeply moved with compassion. Everything in him turns over and he reaches towards his son. He picks up the skirts of his robes and he does the thing that no dignified older Jewish man does and runs down the road to embrace his boy, to make it all right. It's in responding to this deep sense of compassion that Jesus, within himself, that Jesus finds healing and renewed purpose. Let's notice that this is directed towards all that come. Everybody. There's no sorting out of sheep and goats. There are no questions, there's no quizzing, there is no purity or holiness tests. They're there and they're in pain, just like he has been. And that's all that matters. No one's excluded. And not only does Jesus meet the spiritual, psychic, and physical pain, he assures them that the whole of them matters to him. They're not to go home without full bellies. Here's the thing. My conviction, friends, is that Jesus cares for us in the same way. He yearns for us in our confusion, our lostness, our brokenness, not in judgment and condemnation, but reaches toward each of us to offer healing, hope, and new beginnings. Amen. God bless you.